All right, it looks like we are on air now. So, welcome to the Fane of Fantasy. So, today we wanted to have a bit of fun with trying to create unique environments in fantasy world building. And to help me do that, I have Autumn here as well. So, maybe you want to say some words about yourself and who you are.
Hi, I'm Autumn Birt. I'm a fantasy writer. I first published in 2012, which somehow makes me an old hat at this now. I don't know. I don't feel that old of a hat. But I am currently about to release, I'm so excited, my 12th book.
Oh, cool.
And it is the 5th in my current epic fantasy series. I actually had a first trilogy, so this is the second trilogy set in the same world with the same characters. And I also have a 4-book dystopian apocalyptic series as well. So I absolutely love writing. My production level has been a little slow the last year. I usually produce at least 2 books a year, but this last one was a challenge, which is really kind of fun. I think I tell people if it hadn't been my 12th book and I didn't have that confidence, I would have so just deleted the whole thing and just given up. But yeah, everyone's got to have challenges every once in a while. So I'm really excited. And so I'm just excited because I can't believe I actually managed to produce this sucker. It's so huge. And I think it's my biggest, longest book to date.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, over 127,000 words, which is pretty long for me. I usually average around 105. So
Right.
it's good for an epic fan. I mean, it's not 200,000, but it's a big book and a lot of subplots and plots and a really cool world. And I'm really excited to be here, and I'm really excited to release that hopefully next month in April.
Oh, yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
And maybe I don't know if that your book there, it could maybe be a lead into, maybe you have some specific unique environments in there or something like that, so that we could try and latch on to that. Of course, we want to try to aim towards a bit of how-to stuff here. So if we can make something on how can people do this stuff themselves, and some of our joint ideas here on giving some inspiration away, that I think that's the value really here that we should try to aim for, at least.
Sounds great. Well, I mean, I know one of the reasons you and I first started talking is we're both into maps. We both love maps and drawing maps. And I drew my first map for my world. It was one of the first things I did when it was actually probably during my rewrite, when I realized I don't know enough about the world. I knew when I first started writing that I wanted to do something different. So much fantasy is based on like medieval forests. I wanted something different. And so I drew the map. And through that, I started seeing, there's water features here. I happen to have a background in ecology, and I worked for 16 years for an agricultural conservation group. So I know a lot about food. I'm kind of into, odd ecology. And I said, okay, looking at this world, what are some of the different things that, it shouldn't all just be like medieval. And actually mine is kind of Mediterranean based, but still I can't have all villas in Italy. It doesn't work that way. There's got to be more to that. And so that really the map is really, to me, the key start. Once you have that and you start throwing in some features like rivers, and you start thinking about weather systems and storms, like I mentioned, we were talking before about I think it's called the Catatumbra area in South America, where there is a storm that averages 260 days a year, a lightning storm. So that's in the world, that's our world. And I think there's a lot of times, if we're going to base medieval fantasy on our medieval fantasy, medieval world, why don't we look outside at some of the crazy features that are available, here in our own setting? Look at the Salt Lake Flats in Utah in the United States, Yellowstone, where we've got geysers and just volcanoes. I always loved Santorini and Vesuvius, all these great volcanoes where there were major cities around them. And what must it be like knowing that's in your backyard?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, I'm already, my brain is already going off scope here. This is what happens when you do live stuff. But but one of the things you just said about the storming stuff, the storm there in South America, it just made me think about, apart from making unique environments, it's also pretty cool when you can think of ways how a unique environment could influence the people living there. For example, if you had in the fantasy setting, there is like constant lightning storms or whatever, and maybe the lightnings are deadly or whatever in that setting. What would people do when they build their cities and houses? And do they even go outside, or do they tunnel underneath ground? Or it can give a lot of inspiration, even a small piece like a storm like that.
Oh yeah, and it's so funny you say that, because that's one of the things I ended up doing. So it's Mediterranean based, and there's I also have that dry season. So there's a dry season and a rainy season. Well, there's a place where all the storms kind of sweep from, and it's called the Coast of Storms, and it is in a perpetual storm. And just to make it really fun and challenging, because it's a sailing world, it's got black rocks too. So we're talking about a night black storm and black jagged coastline.
Oh, yeah.
But then people have to eat. So I'm like, well, plants are obviously not going to be growing off of sunlight. So now we got carnivorous plants, but I decided to make them valuable. So, people are going to risk their lives to go there to get some of these resources, because the rest of the world's going to pay prime price. And so you start creating that. And so, yeah, and agreed, there's a lot of people, they tend not to put windows in. Why would you build a window if all you're going to look at is lightning? So it's a different fantasy. And I decided, well, let's do something really different. And so the stones, every time there's a lightning burst, that electric discharge actually goes through the stones. And so that was always fun to write. They're going down a dark tunnel or a dark hallway, because to them, they're from a different area. They've come here, and to them it's dark, but everyone else, they're kind of used to low light conditions. And, lightning streaks, and suddenly the whole hallway all the way down will light up in this little fizzle burst. And so you get to have these little glimpses of what's ahead and what else is in this place. And that was so much fun to write. It'd be so much more cool to visit, but
as long as you can stay indoors, at least.
Yeah, and just to make it even more fun, it's called the Black Marsh, and it has the bones of the creatures who live there can absorb power. So even if you're a magician, you can't use magic there. So you're really out of your element in so many ways. And so, yeah, going through there is really just one of the most dangerous places in my books.
Yeah.
But it's also cool to go there all the time.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess it sounds like your starting point was the map. Yes. But how did you go from the map to, let's say, let's have an area with lightnings and all of that? Was that just the real life in middle South American inspiration you kind of chucked in there, or how did you go about that?
It was sort of started that way, but I knew the story starts in the northern part of if it was the Mediterranean, so maybe it'd be like on the Costa del Sol. So it starts kind of on that warm southern Spanish tropical area. And I decided I wanted the rainy season. And so first it started with, you're going to have a storm sweeping through. It's going to make the crossing to what would be Africa in our world. But, there it's a whole different country, it's almost steppes. So if you can imagine like the Russian Mongolian steppes, that's sort of right below it where Africa would be with us. And so that's the crossing. And it's a very dangerous place because of these massive storms. And when you're thinking, okay, that's great, that's a huge fun fantasy element to challenge them, make it challenging to reach this area where they have to go. But where do the storms come from? I mean, they can't just, they magically pop up. I told you I have this background in ecology and environmental science, and my husband loves meteorology. I mean, we have all this weather stations and equipment and map hurricanes. We're so geeks that way. So I'm like, well, it's got to come from somewhere. I know, storms sweep off Africa. They hit the United States. It's hurricanes. So it's got to come from somewhere. And that origin point became the Coast of Storms. And that's really how it develops. So it starts, like you said, with a map, but you start layering in the realistic, how does this whole world interact and develop? Mm-hmm. And that's how, but you were even mentioning before about cultures, so there's other areas where I always love that idea of how would you adapt to benefits. So we talked about this area with no light, but even more normal areas. I have one that's along a coast and it's more windswept. And so I imagine that in the soil, so it's very coastal, but very like big bluffs. Imagine the fjords and stuff. Well, it's scant soil, and I'm always, like I said, I'm always thinking about food because I just love food. And I come from this agricultural background, so I know you have to feed people, even in your, I loved Hammurabi, I think was one of the games back in the 80s. That was one of the first computer games where you had to make sure you fed people or everyone died. I was totally addicted. I just love having to make sure you maintain all those resources. And so I'm thinking of this windswept place with these giant cliffs and thinking, okay, if I was living there, and that's what it comes down to. What would it take for me to live there and survive? I'd build these little rock walls, as a windbreak, and okay, you have to start building up the soil, and you have these little garden plots, and it becomes this huge challenge you have to put in your mind and really put yourself in these places and say, what would it be like to live there, and how would you adapt to survive? And not just survive, hopefully thrive. Otherwise, you're going to start dying out. And then that's a whole different challenge in your fantasy world when you just got a couple of people running around trying to maintain a culture that's on extinction list.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that is a really good point, because I mean, if you want to, which we do want to do, of course, but if we want to create immersion with our setting, then it has to, just like with the map making, really, that I think we've talked about several times in the past as well, it has to have some kind of base in reality. So if people were living here and there were no food, they would just move. I mean, there's no reason to stay here.
No.
I mean, that there has to be something else than because we want to have our setting or environment to be unique, but at the same time, we also have it to be believable. And it will not be if nobody can live there, really. If it's so kind of foreign or dangerous, that you can't grow any crops, or maybe you can, I don't know, maybe you could harness the powers of the lightning some way and trade it off for food with some other nation or something,
Exactly. And that's sort of why even deciding to make, like, in my Coast of Storms, make those plants or some of the bones of the, there's a huge import. The bones of the animals reduce magic. How many people want to, grab that and make that a resource so that they cannot be, have magic used against them? Or if you're going to capture someone who has magic, well, you'd make the bars of your prison cell out of those bones. So it's got to be worth the effort for these people to stay there and live. Otherwise, you're right. They're going to get on the first ship heading to someone with sunlight and tropical weather.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, I mean, in this example, or in your setting here, then it sounds like it's more kind of a natural formed storm. But of course, one could also go the route with creating something where it's magic based in some way.
Absolutely.
But then, well, I guess it kind of goes in the same direction as such. But then again, there you would have to think about, so how does that influence, if you have spellcasters, for example, how would it influence them if you're in the middle of this kind of magic? I don't know what to call it, but flux of magic. You're standing in the middle of it, and would you be able to conjure your own spells then? I don't know, but
well, that's what I loved about the movie Avatar, and they had the world Pandora, and so they had that. They ended up turning into, I think that was the stone that they were mining, and whatever it was could reverse gravity, and that's why it had floating islands. So you have this explanation that they're, I don't know, it had the weirdest names like Ultimatum or something. It was so goofy. But that's why the people from Earth were there, destroying the natives, because they wanted this incredibly valuable resource that also was basically what powered the magic and the neural net and all those connectivity. And so if you're in the middle of it, to them it's this huge sacred site. To everyone else, it was a resource. And that was just to be a really good instance of taking magic and creating something that had rules and created such a unique environment, and turning that into a story and really making that's sort of what the entire cusp of that entire story and the conflict was all about, this one valuable thing that created this amazing world. And I grew up reading Anne McCaffrey and her books on Pern. And there, the idea is they had something called threads that fell through the air, and whatever they touched melted. It hit the soil, crops, people, anything. It just was destroyed. And that's why they had dragon riders, because the dragons could eat and destroy the threads before they hit the ground. And so it became, that is the whole point of her stories. And it all started just because of a unique environment.
Mm.
And that's, I think, a lot of what we're looking for in fantasy. Sometimes we've moved away a little bit, maybe from having the story be the environment. Often it's just, you know, they're traveling through it. But it's such an amazing creation when you can make the environment really part of the story. And sometimes the entire movement, the whole plot of the story is resting on the fact that it is this environment.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, at least for myself, I mean, I really enjoy when the setting or the world almost is a character as well.
Yeah.
You know, that it plays in more than just it's more than just soil or lands you're walking on, but it kind of affects the world in some way, or at least affects the people living there. Same thing in my own trilogy. For example, I have this forest realm in the southern area of the world, and the people living there, they kind of they are so much in symbiosis with the forest that they can't really venture outside. So, or they can, but if they do, they will catch a disease called the field blight. So it will kill them if they don't get back into the forest pretty quickly. And of course, I shove my characters out there, of course, so they have fun out there when they'll die.
That's so. I have something very, very similar, which is funny, because when I was creating, again, I was trying to stay away from traditional Tolkien fantasy. I wanted to do something different, partially because I wanted to do something different, even though I grew up immersed and loving it. It didn't fit my characters, and I wanted a long-lived species, kind of foresty, but I didn't want elves, because I think of elves and we think of that traditional fantasy concept. They're kind of snooty, and I wanted something very common and down to earth. So I created a culture called the Kith. And sort of the same thing with yours. They're symbiotically tied to trees. Their souls are housed in these trees. So they want to stay there. If their tree dies, they will die. But they also live as long as their trees. And we're talking about, like, redwood, sequoia. So massive trees, and they live among them, huge environment, and it's their culture. But the sort of the same thing, if they leave, which they used to leave a lot more, but there's been warfare, people are people. So they decided they're coming more and more, just staying in one place, more introverted, and kind of guard their borders. But if they leave, they're drawn back, because, I mean, you're leaving part of yourself behind.
Right.
And so it's the same thing. I keep kicking him out. There's always things going on. And talk about, when it comes to warfare, a huge vulnerability. Your tree dies, you die. The last thing you want is someone coming in and causing havoc. So, of course, that's
setting the forest on fire or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is literally the crux of the first trilogy. I mean, that is the final epic battle scene is there at the gates of the forest. And it is, and not every tree is tied to a person. There are smaller enclaves. There's some trees that are just big trees. You just don't know unless you know. But maybe your family knows, but no one else knows which tree is yours.
Yeah.
So it was fun and challenging to write. But it was a fun culture as well, because it's tied, like I said, you tie it to the environment, and it's really important. And then kind of environment trees like that would need. So it's a big misty forest, you need water, you need resources. It was sort of jungly. It was fun.
Yeah. And I think actually in terms of when we talk about how to create unique environments, I mean, that's basically a good example, I think, because that was probably a good example of the opposite of what we talked about before. So before you kind of figured out, okay, I want an environment with these kind of storms, and then secondly, how does it affect the people? But another way to go about creating your own unique environment, it could be the other way around here. So thinking about, okay, I want these kind of people, and then where would they live, and then because of those people you wanted, then the environment became unique because of it. And I think it's basically two different routes to take, and the goal or the result is still a unique environment in both cases.
Absolutely. And I think I think I did a blog post, but I always go back to, as much as I hate to say it, The Princess Bride and the Fire Swamp. So if you're writing fantasy and you're trying to create a culture, just a place that is unique and really set to your world, three things. You need 3 aspects that are truly unique about that spot and that area that really set it apart from every other place. So in the Fire Swamp in The Princess Bride, they have the fire lightning sands, which are really fast, like quicksand. They have flame spurts, which just they pop out of the ground, and you're toasted if you happen to be over one. And they have they call them ROUSs, rodents of unusual size, which are the inhabitants of the Fire Swamp. So if you can create the 3 things, it just took 3 things to make a swamp into the Fire Swamp. And there's, if you know Princess Bride, as soon as someone says the Fire Swamp, you're like, oh yeah, have you seen any RUSs today? So I just think that is you don't need 10 things. If you're writing things, you don't need a dozen things. You need, if you can find 3 things that you make unique about every single place in your fantasy world, it's a good start. It could be the person, who's living there, but usually if it's just the climate, something that is different and unique about that area. I have a marsh as well. There's lots of little critters, living amid things, and there's this weird, strange, hazy aura. And I didn't know what the aura was until I was writing about it, and one of the characters says, oh, that's the dragon Isha. And I was like, oh, well, the swamp has a dragon. And she's out there she's the one who creates all the channels. And it just completely changed what was going on in this marsh that until that point was just kind of a marsh.
But I was also just thinking, Autumn, that one could also go the complete other way. So if we had a completely normal kind of medieval fantasy town, and there is really nothing environmentally unique about all this, but we want it to become a unique place in our fantasy setting, we could also just take what we actually started out with your first example there, and just look at the people, the people living in there, and you could find a way to create some kind of factions in there that pits against each other, but not like your common factions. You have your thieves guild over there, and then the guards over there, but something more unique in that sense. But my point is more to say that a completely mundane and normal medieval town, you can make that unique by just what you stuff inside it as well.
Absolutely. I wish I could remember the name of the book. I actually looked it up based on a short story I read, and it takes place just in one town. And it is a normal town, but I mean, it has people who fence, but the whole thing is just the interaction of the people, and the intrigues. And yeah, it really does come down, the environment is great, but if you can create interesting people, interesting characters, and have them move through the environment so that it feels real, it doesn't matter. I mean, you could be writing fantasy, you could be on an isolated spaceship. It is an incredible story. It really is the characters.
Yeah, absolutely. I have in my Keystone Bones series, I have a city that we don't really visit it in the series, but it's on the map, all the way over to the east side of the land. I have a city called Etris Descent, which is, and Etris is basically the god of light and life, and it's called that because they believed, at least in the legends, it's said that she at some point descended there on a hill. There is like a big hill just outside the city, so she descended there, and when she did, all the women in the entire area just got pregnant instantly. So you can also kind of play with stuff like that.
Oh, I love that. That is great.
Yeah. Well, she is the god of life, so something has to happen if she comes and sets her foot on the hill there.
And I love those little cruxes that go with novels. I mean, those are sometimes the key to creating such an interesting plot and change in the plot. I know for me, I had one that I racked my brain. There were 2 characters sort of fighting over a magical talisman. And the one said, what's the price? And she never really gave an answer. And it bothered me through the entire book, trying to figure out what the price of this thing was.
Right.
And when I finally figured it out, it completely changed the course of book 3. So it's sometimes sometimes there's little nuggets of coming up with something that really relates to the story, relates to the characters, relates to the environment, that can alter where the book goes. And I know we've talked before about map making, and I sometimes think that's why making a map is so important to me too, is because if you're writing, you send them off between town A and town B. But if you have a map and you look at where town A is and where town B is, you suddenly get an idea for distance. You get an idea for how many days that'll take. Suddenly you realize they go through a forest, then over a mountain pass, and over across this giant river, and the story becomes so much more interesting. And that's when you become more involved in the environment as a reader and as a writer. Yeah.
And that is definitely a good place to start for inspiration to create unique environments. Because if you know, as you said, characters are gonna go from A to B, there is a forest there in the middle, but then it's a good starting point to figure out how can I make this forest more immersing, in the sense that I'll put something in there that is unique in some way, and all of a sudden you have a unique environment sitting right there between the 2 points. Yeah. And it's not just a common forest that somebody walks through all of a sudden, and it just makes it a ton more interesting.
It does. And that's actually probably why I originally drew the map. I knew I needed to go from A, I went up to a B, and then down to a C. And so suddenly I had, all these different areas. And when I started looking at the different areas, I realized, well, people here are going to live more, they're going to be more alike than the people here. So suddenly I have two different cultures. So you start looking at those different aspects and kind of defining them. And the world became really unique and different, which I thought was fascinating. I think I ended up with 7 or 8 different cultures just because I realized that those were different regions of the map. And they would have adapted differently. Some of them literally adapted, like the one marsh dwellers, they actually have finned, between their fingers because they live in water constantly. So it's just like, those little tweaks and little nuances that make a story so unique. In a world so unique and hopefully memorable, like Threads on Pern.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think basically how to draw inspiration to, how to create these unique environments. I mean, I think good places to start, as we've talked about here, is looking at what exists in the real world of strange places, and then try to see if you can do some nice twists on those, or at least get inspired from them and do something else with it than one would expect, or the characters like we talked about. But another thing I'm also thinking is, I kind of like the ideas of when you have like just a small mundane item, like I don't know what, a bracelet or something, and it's completely mundane, but then maybe it can open, and if you do, it'll change the entire region and make everything ice cold or something. It'll draw the ice age back or something. Something where a small item that seems like a throwaway thing that doesn't matter is all of a sudden very unique in itself, but also the craft of unique environments. I kind of like ideas like that as well.
Yeah,
because I think it's unexpected, really.
Yeah, and it's funny because I did actually play with that. There was since my world is based on actually elements, and I have 5 elements just to be challenging, but I do have earth, air, water, and fire. And each of them has a temple, a place where it was worshipped, and a house that turned out a sphere of that element. And the one was called the Temple of Ice, and it was completely frozen over, and it was supposed to be the Temple of Water. And so I had to create this story of why it's actually near the area of the Kith with the big trees. I'm like, okay, that's warm and temperate, big trees. Why is this place that is encased in ice? And creating that story, what happened for this to have occurred, and can it be reversed? Okay, now what was it before? Oh, it was the Temple of Mists. All the mist solidified, so that's why it's ice now. And it created a whole, I might actually go back and write at least a short story about that, but it's just hinted at in the books. But it's fun to create that kind of aspect and that kind of world, and go ahead and do something using magic that is completely, I don't think we're going to run into a temple of ice in the middle of, say, Africa here, but you never know. Kilimanjaro is right on the equator. It has snow. Anything's possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just, my mind was just going in the direction of that magic stuff, because I think you can make such interesting things with using magic, but at the same time, I also think it should kind of go hand in hand with a word of caution, because it's also a too easy way out often, right? I mean, if we can't really explain something, then that's magic. Don't worry. I mean, that's too easy.
It is too easy. I always say magic has to have rules too. So I had to figure out, mine was all my magic is based on elements. So how did it become frozen? You know, did you take away fire? Why would water just suddenly freeze? I had to come up with an explanation, because otherwise it shouldn't be in my world. Just like going back to Avatar and Pandora, the islands floated. They didn't just float because of magic. It was actually the interaction of an element that was only on the planet. And yeah, always magic has to have rules, just like gravity. It's not fair, but you have to have a reason it happens and the reason it doesn't happen. And exactly. I always say you always have to have a reason it's defeatable. So you can never have someone with amazing God who can't be defeated, because guess what? They won. End of story. It was 2 sentences.
Absolutely true, and I think basically as soon as you start going down that route, then there is a whole new set of inspiration for you there, because when you then start making the rules, then you can start thinking about, okay, so why are these rules the way they are, and what would the consequences be of those, and maybe the people who then have to abide to those rules, what does that do to their culture, etc. So we could just keep on, and this is why world building becomes so addictive. So because you can just keep on and on and on and on.
And it's so little if it actually makes to the novel. I mean, I know I wrote a companion just because it's like you love doing this so much, so you have to put it all somewhere. I know there's a companion to Tolkien. I mean, we love it so much, and we spend months, and you see like a glimmer of it in the books.
Yeah,
but it's such a beautiful glimmer.
It is, absolutely. I think, is there any other very good ideas you have on how to create unique environments that we should kind of close off on? Because I think we're coming up to about half an hour or something like that now.
Okay. I think, like I said, always start with a map. The map is the best way to do it. And then when you just delve into an area and really set yourself into the world and say, you know, for me, I had one that was little fingers of an archipelago. Like I said, imagine it was Mediterranean-ish, but you know, start with at least 3 things. What is different about this place that isn't Italy? What can I say about the people? The culture? How old is it? Start asking yourself those questions. Look at the environment. Decide if there's something really kind of different going on, and start building a world and some cultures and some people. But to me, it is always set yourself in it and imagine standing there. What do you smell? What do you feel? What would you eat? Because again, back to food. I always have to figure that one out. And if you can figure that out and see what kind of magic you would have, even though you create rules, I always say, doesn't mean every culture doesn't have a different type of magic. Not everyone in the same world has to have it work the same way. And then you really get into some interesting places.
Very cool. I think I want to say thank you, Autumn, for taking your time out to come on this hangout and share some of your thoughts on how to create unique environments. And I truly hope for all of you out there watching this that you can pull some inspiration out of this yourselves and create some cool immersive environments out of what we talked about here as well for your own settings and worlds. So is there any place where you want to plug here, Autumn, on where people can find out more about you? And I can also put links in the description field, of course.
Oh, that'd be great. I have 2 websites. If you're looking for writing tips, especially fantasy writing tips, that's what I try to do most of my posts about, is just autumnwriting.com. That is my writing tip blog. And then all my books are at autumnbooks.co, or actually just autumnbirt.com. We'll point you to the same place, and you can learn a little bit about my books, or you can learn a bit about more tips on writing fantasy.
All right. Thank you so much, Autumn. And if there's anybody out there who have some very cool ideas on how to create unique environments, which we have not touched upon, and you think somebody else could benefit from knowing those, please chuck them into the comment field below, and let's see what everybody else can come up with as well. So thank you.
Comments that if you what worlds you've created, I think that'd be really great.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, cheers, and see you next Monday.